The bridge that changed the map of Europe. Okay.
This bridge.
Tiltas pakeitęs Europos žemėlapį. Aš nežinau, kas čia per kanalas, man tiesiog sudomino apie kažkokį žiauriai aukštą ir fenomenalų tiltą pasakoja.
This bridge should not have been possible. It's the Millau Viaduct in France, the tallest bridge in the world. In fact, even today, in all of Europe, there are only 4 skyscrapers taller than it. It soars 340 meters above the Tarn Valley and stretches for 2.4 kilometers. For decades, its critics said it could never be built. When it was finished, it changed the map of Europe and could be seen from space.
Čia absurdiškai didelė konstrukcija, bet O kodėl jis statė čia? Kodėl negalėjo tiesiog, į nuokalnę padaryti kažkaip nuvažiavimą? Asiuminu, kad tikrai čia brangiau kainavo aplinkosaugos, nesąmonė. Nežinau.
Kilometers. For decades, its critics said it could never be built. When it was finished, it changed the map of Europe and could be seen from space. To construct it, the deck had to slide across 7 enormous towers in a technique that was so innovative, no one was really sure if it would work.
And I was absolutely terrified. I was physically sick with apprehension. Was it the right decision?
To celebrate the 20th anniversary of the bridge's opening, we sat down with renowned architect Lord Norman Foster in a special interview, tracing the viaduct's journey from impossibility to icon.
It's an extraordinary fusion of talents right across every aspect of society, from the politicians through to the extraordinary individuals who made it.
Lord Norman Foster is one of the world's most accomplished architects. If you don't know his name, then you'll definitely recognise some of his projects. The Gherkin, the Reichstag, almost every Apple store you walk into. And of course, the epic Apple Park. His practice continues to define the skylines of America, Asia, the UK and Europe. But it's this project that may be his most breathtaking. This is the bridge above the clouds, the Millau Viaduct.
What the actual fuck?
France has a problem. This is Massif Central. It's a beautiful, rugged mountainous terrain that covers about 15% of the country. It also severs France in 2. These same gorges, rivers and forests make it an incredibly hard landscape for anyone to cross, coming from the north to the south of the country, or from northern Europe to Spain. Now, for centuries, that divided Europe and meant that central France could not develop due to a lack of adequate transportation links. The roads and train lines that did exist were mostly single lane and would have to dip and rise into these steep valleys or make massive detours. Many villages didn't have proper connections to the outside world at all. In the summer months, those travelling from cities like Paris to the south of France would have to come through here. This is Millau, a picturesque village surrounded by beautiful countryside. During this time, it became pretty much the worst bottleneck in Europe. The congestion would add 5 hours to any journey and extend 20 kilometers in both directions. Then, in the 1980s, the French government decided to solve this problem. Massive freeways were built through the region, but the question remained what to do about the worst part of the bottleneck. What to do about Millau? Should the village be bypassed altogether? Should a bridge be constructed over the Tarn River? But where would you put it? Geologists and specialists worked for years to figure out where on earth this bridge could go. The valley was wide and steep and prone to landslides. It was a bit of a nightmare. Engineer Michel Verligo and his team then had a light bulb moment. What if the road didn't go into the valley at all? What if the bridge just went directly over it? It was an incredibly bold idea and something that had never been done on such a scale before. The French government thought Verligo was insane and the bridge was put to rest for the time being. In fact, if it hadn't been for the success of another bridge a few hundred miles away, the Millau Viaduct might never have happened. Verligo was working on the Pont de Normandie, which was completed in 1994. It's an incredible cable-stayed bridge that crosses the Seine right before it empties out into the ocean. Seeing this bridge convinced the French government that the Millau Viaduct might just be possible.
Tai yra tokios masyvios struktūros, tai yra iš tikrųjų tokios masyvios struktūros. Man labai patinka tie didžiuliai tiltai, nu, aš nežinau, kiek aš didžiulių tiltų matęs gyvenime, bet, nu, tai didesni jau, tarkim, ten, kur aš ten buvau, Švedijoje buvau, ten yra mažas tiltas, palyginti čia, nu, labai mažas tiltas, bet net jis, kai tu eini jo ir, pavyzdžiui, prie tų, tipo, sustoji, nu, tu pakeli galvą ir, nu, tai yra masyvi konstrukcija, tik aš ant kokio tilto 5 kartus mažesnio buvęs, net neįsivaizduoju, kaip čia net palyginti reiktų, bet, tipo, čia yra antiek masyvios konstrukcijos, my goodness.
After all. Vertigo had one condition. If the bridge was going to cross the Tarn Gorge, it would have to add to the landscape, not take away from it. It would have to be beautiful. And that is where architect Lord Foster came in.
You only get one first impression, and it was just a meeting of minds. I mean, when we started to engage with each other and talk about the idea of the competition, it's rare that you engage with somebody and when you're talking issues of structure or aesthetics, that you find you're on the same wavelength. The chemistry was and is fantastic.
An international competition was held to decide on the design for the bridge. It was not especially common for architects to be involved in massive national infrastructure projects like this, so Lord Foster would have to prove his worth.
I think it's very rare. I think the government agency that was tasked with the idea of the competition realized environmentally it was so sensitive that there should be from the outset a visual aesthetic coupling to the engineering.
A cable-stayed bridge was chosen over more traditional structures like a suspension bridge. Cable-stayed bridges are more efficient at carrying heavy loads and they can support a more slender deck, meaning it's much nicer to look at. Everything about the viaduct was done to minimise its visual impact. Lord Foster even reduced the number of piers to 7 from the 9 that Vertigo had initially proposed. Foster and Vertigo's design won hands down. They put forward something more than just a bridge. It was an extension of the natural beauty of the valley itself. A philosophical concept, not just a functional one.
I remember collaborating with Buckminster Fuller for the last 12 years of his life, and I remember him saying something like, I never try and make something beautiful, but at the end of the process, if it's not beautiful, then somehow it's wrong.
Now, the real work began. Once plans for the bridge were officially announced, there was an outcry from locals and environmentalists. Like Lord Foster, many feared the natural beauty of the landscape would be ruined by a colossal bridge that was taller than the Eiffel Tower. There were also fears that while the bridge would assuage the bottleneck, it could negatively affect the economy of Wallau. There was now more pressure on Foster and Vertigo than ever before. This enormous, record-breaking bridge would also need to be invisible. Now, managing any business can feel like an impossible task. Even if it's not an invisible bridge taller than many skyscrapers in Europe, that doesn't mean business. In fact, that amazing bridge in the clouds. At this stage, the piers would be taller than any building in Europe, and they'd be sitting in open fields with no other structures around them for scale. They would look even more gigantic. So, to balance this, Lord Foster wanted them to disappear into the sky.
The idea that the column is faceted and is like a tuning fork, and you can see through it, that was simultaneously, visually, slimming it, but at the same time responding to the expansion and contraction in a more economic way. So performance, economy, integrity, optimized structure all go hand in hand.
The towers would get more slender as they rose, dividing into two prongs, more or less halving from the 24 metres wide at their base to the 11 metres width at the top. Now, while that's aesthetically pleasing, it also served another purpose as well. You see, the Wallau Viaduct had another big obstacle to contend with: the wind. Wind speeds could blow through the Tarn Gorge at more than 130 miles an hour. The two prongs in each of the piers allowed for the deck above to move but be stable while the wind could pass through the gaps. It also allowed for the deck to expand and contract, as metal tends to do on warm days. This was another example of the harmonious relationship between engineering and architecture that this bridge demanded. But there was one pressing issue that kept Lord Foster awake at night. What colour should the bridge be? It sounds simple enough, but the choice could make or break the entire project. The viaduct couldn't exactly be bright red like the Golden Gate Bridge.
That's not a cosmetic decision. It has enormous visual impact. If you decide that the landscape is the protagonist, is the main player, then that will lead you to doing those cables dark, because they would disappear into the landscape, but they would be dominant against the sky. If you make them light, they would disappear into the sky.
Lord Foster realised that most people looking at the viaduct would be seeing it from below, either from the village or from the deck as they drove across it. So the bridge would need to blend in with the sky, not the valley around it. In the end, he chose grey.
I was absolutely terrified. I was physically sick with apprehension. Now, was it the right decision? It's binary. There's no halfway.
Spacing the piers was its own challenge. They'd have to sit equal distances apart, but also be structurally efficient, buildable, and economical.
There's a trade-off between the cost of a span.
Kiek laiko statė ilgiau negu stadioną, kaip galvoja?
Because the longer the span, generally, the more expensive it becomes. But then, the shorter the span, the more piers. And each pier has 4 deep piles. And each pier obviously has a cost.
In the end, the team compromised with a span of 342 metres in between each pier. These piers, each one taller than a skyscraper, then began their construction. GPS was used for positioning, and project engineers sunk them deep into the valley bedrock and covered them with reinforced concrete. The deck was made from hollow steel and prefabricated in sections at the Eiffel factory in eastern France. Yes, that Eiffel. Each section was then floated down the Rhine to the Mediterranean, to the French coast, and then driven by road to the construction site. The deck was then slid across the completed towers using enormous hydraulics that pushed them steadily across the valley piece by piece each day. They were launched simultaneously from both sides over temporary structural supports. Now, during this time, the weather had to be closely monitored. Strong winds could damage the deck before it reached the next supporting tower, and each launching operation would take up to 3 days. Even with GPS, it wasn't certain that the deck would meet in the middle, that the piers would line up, or that the colour was the correct one.
Whether it's a bridge or whether it's a building, we now have more sophisticated...
Tai, kad žmogus, kaip rasė, gali pastatyti, ir suplanuoti, ir pastatyti tokius dalykus. Čia aišku, čia kaip žmonės pasiekimas, čia nėra didžiausias, ten visokių, dar tikslesnių yra ten su kosmosu susijusių panašiai, bet, iš to civilizacijos statymo, kaip čia, aspekto, kad tokį galim pastatyti, kaip žmogus. Ir tada kiti debilai, kaip ten 5G ryšys, vakcina. Apgailėtina, apgailėtina, ant kiek ta pati rasė, bet ant kiek yra skirtumas galimybių intelektinių. Jesus Christ. Kita vertus, šiandien intelektinės gal galimybės matuojam labiau, nes profesija tokia, bet bet... Damn.
Means
labai daug mokslo, labai daug tikslumo, labai daug...
But the truth is, until you actually see the real thing, you really don't know.
The day the two halves were...
Matai, kad tiltas atlaikys, tai čia, kaip suprantu, matematika, fizika, ten matematika, chemija, nežinau, ten, bet paskaičiuoja ir tada jau kaip ir viskas kaip ir tvarkoj. Spalva, tai kaip žmonės priims ir kaip atrodys, čia kažin ar pagal kažkokią matematiką gali paskaičiuoti.
Due to meet was a nerve-wracking one for everyone involved. In the end, it was achieved with millimeters.
Nežinau, ar Egipto piramidės buvo toks feat. Nes ten, darbo daug, žmonių, tos manpower reikėjo, laiko. Bet ar to, kaip čia, planavimo tokio, ir inžinerijos, ar ten, aš nežinau, kiek iš tikrųjų reikėjo, bet ar tiek reikėjo, nes man atrodo, čia 100 piramidžių būtų lengviau pastatyti negu vieną tokį, nežinau.
to precision. It was only now that the architecture and engineering teams could view their bridge and see if it was actually a success.
The relief, I can't tell you. And again, it's only when you come on the approach road and wonderfully, you realize it was the right decision.
From the beginning, Lord Foster didn't want the road to be a simple straight line. He wanted it to curve across the valley so that as you drove across it, you got a true sense of the bridge's scale.
It's on a 20-kilometer arc. When you drive over that bridge and it unfolds, so you're seeing the piers disappearing in perspective. The sides are transparent, and it's very, very difficult to find a bridge where you can drive over and you can actually see, you feel you're on that shelf. So you've got all the safety, all the protection, but you can see across. So it's the closest you can get to flight, and when that is literally above the clouds.
Far from destroying the economy of Malau, the bridge became an instant icon and a tourist attraction in its own right. Visitors come far and wide to see the bridge and the village, but now there's no congestion.
When I was last there, somebody came up to me and said something along the lines of, when you were doing this project, I protested it. This individual said, I just want to tell you, we were wrong.
The road opened up this area of France and changed the map of Europe. Within 3 years, the bridge had paid for itself. The detour also saves around 40,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions from heavy goods vehicles alone. That's the equivalent of 40,000 trees absorbing emissions over 40 years. This viaduct illustrates, perhaps more than any other, the importance of good design and the power of involving architects in infrastructure projects. It shows that architects and engineers can achieve remarkable things when they truly work in harmony.
It's really important to break down the barriers between the different parties, because in the end, all of these things are in the public domain. And in my experience, the more views, the better.
Because of its beauty, this bridge doesn't detract from the landscape around it, it only adds to it and elevates this place to new heights.
And when you look at it, it's not a work of architecture, not a work of engineering, it's a work of infrastructure. It's unique. It doesn't, you can't compare it with anything else. I mean, you can talk about buildings and you can say, is it this?
Tipo, man yra, šitas matosi. Tu, mieste atsistoji ir tu matai, žinai, masyvus fucking tiltas. Ir amazing iš tikrųjų tokie, bet man visą laiką žavėjo, kaip čia paminėjo tą žodį, infrastruktūra. Kai tu realiai nematai 9% jos. Kai ten tu stovi tiesiog ir tu nematai, ant šaligatvio stovi, bet o kas po žemė yra? Visas, labirintas, vamzdžių, susisiekimo, laidai, kabeliai, ko tik nori. Ir visur, po visą, žinai, miestą, po visus miestus, visam pasaulyje, po visas valstybės, ir infrastruktūra pastatyta civilizacijos, žmonių per tam tikrą ilgą laiką, tobulinta, gerinta. Tik jos nesimato realiai, bet kaip yra sudėtinga ir kaip palaipsniui, kad pastatyti tą, ką mes dabar turim, kad tu sėdi namie, savo oloj, ateina vanduo, ten dujos, elektra, viskas, kas tik gali norėti, dabar ir dėka imigrantų, tai ir maistas ateina. Ne, bet ir tai neatsiranda iš niekur, reikėjo kažkam statyti, kažkam suprojektuoti ir per 100 metų po truputį pastatėm civilizaciją. Ir labai gerą civilizaciją pastatėme, eina savo.
This building or that building, but there's only one Mijo viaduct.
This video was sponsored by Odoo. You can learn more about that at the link below. Don't forget that we're raising awareness of construction's mental health crisis and supporting charities in this space.
Okay, viskas. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdim man kelia.
King man is the man.